You are a plain, silent burden who will never find a rancher to take her in. The stepmother's sharp accusation cut through the freezing canyon. With a rough shove, Maren was cast down into the freezing mud. The heavy wooden wheels of the wagon rolled away, leaving her standing alone under the towering pine trees of the Wind River Range. They had taken her late father's iron tools, the 3 milk cows, and the bags of seed wheat, leaving Maren with only a spare grey dress, a wooden comb and a pair of brass spectacles. As the dust disappeared over the distant ridge, the wind swept down from the jagged peaks, dragging dry sagebrush across the trail. With every gust, the thin wool shawl around her shoulders fluttered, offering little defense against the cold that crept through the seams of her boots. With no home, no money, and the wilderness closing in, she faced a grim choice: walk or let the freeze claim her. Maren adjusted the strap of her canvas bundle, bowed her head against the gale, and began to walk. The Wyoming prairie stretched out in front of her like an endless sea of dry grass, bending flat under the grey sky. The air carried the damp metallic scent of coming snow, a silent warning that winter was arriving weeks early in the territory. Maren walked for miles, her blistered heels rubbing against the stiff leather of her boots until her socks were stained with damp red marks. She met no other travelers on the trail, only the occasional hawk circling high above the draws. Her throat was parched, her lips chapped and split by the dry wind that whipped off the peaks. She thought of her father's quiet kindness, a memory that seemed very far away now that the stepmother had cast her out to clear the family's debts. She knew that, in this hard land, weakness was a death sentence. To survive, she would have to rely on the strength of her hands and the resilience she had learned through years of quiet labor. When the afternoon sun began to sink, casting long blue shadows across the coulees, she saw a thin plume of grey smoke rising from a cluster of cottonwoods near a rocky creek bed. As Maren approached the cottonwoods, the details of a struggling homestead came into view. The pine cabin sat quiet on the stony slope of the hill, its unpeeled logs weathered to the color of wet ash. The sod roof was sagging, overgrown with dead weeds that rattled in the wind, and several panes of glass in the front window had been replaced with greased paper. The fence rails around the small corral were splintered and down, leaving the dirt yard open to the road. A small flock of stray sheep, their fleece matted with dark burrs and wild thorns, wandered aimlessly across the frozen ground, searching for dried grass. Near the barn, a tall man stood alone, his broad shoulders strained as he struggled to lift a heavy timber to mend the broken gate. His canvas coat was patched with rough burlap at the elbows, and his hands were bare, the skin red and cracked from the cold. When he heard her footsteps on the gravel, he paused, his chest rising and falling as he wiped the sweat from his forehead with a sleeve, his eyes holding the hollow gaze of a man who had lost his wife and was now drowning under the chores of the frontier. Maren stopped near the broken gate, her small canvas bundle held tight against her chest to keep it from shaking in the wind. She did not ask for charity, nor did she display the heavy exhaustion that threatened to collapse her knees. Caleb watched her with a wary, suspicious gaze, his eyes taking in her thin shawl, her plain face and her worn boots. Strangers on the road were rarely a welcome sight in these isolated valleys, and he waited for her to speak first. Maren looked at the sagging cabin door, then at the skittish sheep shivering in the yard, and finally at the raw, calloused palms of his hands. She stepped forward, her voice low and steady, as she proposed a practical covenant. She whispered that she could cook his meals, clean his cabin, and tend his stray sheep in exchange for winter shelter and simple rations by the stove. Caleb stared at her plain face, looking for any sign of deceit, but saw only the quiet determination of a woman who knew the weight of physical labor. He looked at the heavy timber he could barely lift alone, then nodded slowly and gestured toward the cabin door. The cabin was cold and dark inside, smelling of damp soot and old grease. A layer of grey dust covered the rough pine table, and the iron stove in the corner was cold and empty. In the darkest corner of the room, a 5-year-old girl sat on a low wooden bench, her small body curled tight. She clutched a dirty rag doll to her chest and stared at Maren with wide, cautious eyes. Caleb closed the heavy door against the wind and explained in a quiet, flat voice that her name was Clara. He said she had not spoken a single word, since her mother had passed away the previous autumn, having retreated into a silent world of her own. The child's silence hung in the room like a physical weight, matching the chill of the unlit hearth. Maren did not try to speak to the girl or force her way into her corner. Instead, she set her canvas bundle on the floor, took off her thin shawl, and walked straight to the cold stove to begin her work. Maren knelt in the dust before the iron stove, using a broken shingle to clear the cold, damp ash that filled the firebox. She stacked the dry hickory kindling Caleb brought inside, striking a flint until a spark caught the dry bark and a bright flame began to crackle. She searched the sparse shelves of the pantry, finding only a small sack of dried corn, a jar of lard, and a hard slab of salt pork. Using a heavy stone mortar she found in the lean-to, she began to grind the dried corn into a coarse meal, the rhythmic, heavy sound of stone against stone filling the silent cabin. She mixed the cornmeal with water and a spoonful of lard, shaping the dough into flat cakes. As she fried them on the hot iron stove, the warm scent of hickory smoke and fresh cornmeal filled the room, chasing away the damp chill that had lingered in the corners for months. She placed a golden griddle cake on a wooden plate and set it gently near Clara, then hummed a soft, low frontier tune as she began to scrub the greasy table. Clara watched Maren's hands move in the firelight, her small nose twitching as the scent of the warm cornmeal reached her corner. Slowly, she let go of the rag doll, slid off the bench, and walked to the table. She took a bite of the griddle cake, her eyes locked on Maren, and then ate the rest with a quiet, hungry intensity. When she finished, she looked up at Maren with a tiny, silent smile before returning to her bench with the doll. Caleb sat in the shadows near the hearth, watching his daughter eat, his own plate untouched as a look of quiet wonder passed over his face. The warmth of the fire and the scent of food had broken the long, cold silence that had gripped the homestead since his wife's death. Maren continued her work, wiping down the shelves and washing the wooden bowls with boiling water from the kettle, her movements efficient and practiced. At dawn, the frost lay thick on the prairie, turning the dry sagebrush into silver needles that cracked under Maren's boots. She went out to the corral to begin her work with the stray sheep, which were wild and skittish from weeks of wandering the hills. She walked slowly among them, speaking in a low, calm voice to soothe their fear, until they allowed her to herd them into the pen near the barn. In the tool shed, she found Caleb's heavy iron shears, the blades dull and covered in a thick layer of red rust. She sat on a three-legged stool, using sand and a flat stone to grind the edges until the iron was bright and sharp. She returned to the pen, grabbed the first sheep and held it firmly against her knees as she began to shear the matted wool. Her fingers grew numb from the freezing wind, and the thick, greasy lanolin of the fleece stained her hands. But she did not pause until the animal was clean and the white fleece lay on the dirt. The skittish ewe struggled at first, kicking her hind legs against the dirt, but Maren held her close, whispering the same soft frontier tune she had sung the night before. The iron shears clicked in the cold morning air, shearing the dirty, knotted wool away in thick, greasy sheets. Maren's knuckles rubbed against the rough fleece, her skin catching on the sharp burrs that were tangled in the wool. She worked with careful deliberation, focusing on keeping the blades flat against the sheep's skin to prevent any cuts or nicks. Caleb stood near the barn door, watching the steady rise and fall of her shoulders as she wrestled the heavy animal, his expression one of quiet surprise. When the ewe was finally sheared, she stood up and trotted into the pasture, her new white coat standing out against the grey grass. Maren wiped the sweat from his eyes with her sleeve, her back stiff and aching, but she did not rest before reaching for the next sheep in the pen. By midday, the wind had picked up, carrying dust from the dry draws across the yard, but Maren continued her labor without a word. She sheared 3 more sheep before the sun reached its peak, stacking the heavy, greasy wool in a clean corner of the barn. Her hands were sticky with lanolin, and her skirt was covered in loose fibers and bits of dried grass, but she felt a quiet satisfaction in the physical effort. Caleb joined her in the pen for the final 2 sheep, his broad shoulders helping to hold the larger ram still while she sheared. They worked in silence, a tacit understanding growing between them through the shared effort. When the last sheep was sheared and turned out, The corral felt organized and productive for the first time in months, the small flock grazing peacefully together on the hillside. Maren carried the heavy, dirty fleeces down to the creek, where the water ran fast and cold from the high mountain passes. She knelt on the frosted gravel, dipping the wool into the freezing stream and scrubbing it against a flat rock to wash away the dirt, twigs, and sharp thorns. The water was so cold it made her joints ache, and within minutes her fingers lost all feeling, turning red and raw from the scrubbing. She persisted, rinsing the wool until it was bright and clean, then carried it back to the homestead to dry on clean pine boards. In the evening, she found an old wooden spinning wheel in the back of the barn, its flyer covered in cobwebs and its leather band dry and cracked. She carried it into the cabin, cleaned the dirt from the spokes and oiled the metal spindle with a drop of lard until the wheel turned without a whisper. By the light of a single tallow candle, Maren sat at the spinning wheel, her foot pressing the wooden treadle in a steady, slow rhythm. She fed the clean, dry wool into the spindle, her fingers guiding the fibers as they twisted into strong, even yarn. Clara sat on her bench, watching the wooden wheel spin round and round, her eyes following the movement with quiet fascination. Maren did not speak, letting the rhythmic hum of the wheel fill the cabin and bring a sense of order to the long winter night. Caleb sat nearby, mending a leather harness by the fire, the sound of the wheel acting as a comfort to his tired mind. For the first time in a year, the homestead felt like a place of survival rather than a place of despair. The labor of Maren's hands spinning raw wool into the very thread that would keep them warm. The wheel hummed late into the night, the steady tap of the treadle acting as a heartbeat for the quiet cabin. Maren's fingers moved with instinctive skill, pulling the carded wool into a thin, consistent strand before letting the flyer draw it onto the bobbin. She watched the yarn pile up, noting its thickness and strength, planning to make it into warm clothing and blankets to protect the family from the coming frost. Clara crept closer, her rag doll forgotten on the bench as she stood beside the wheel, watching the yarn slide through Maren's calloused fingers. Maren smiled softly at the child, but did not interrupt the rhythm of her work, knowing that the girl was finding comfort in the quiet, predictable movement. Caleb looked up from his leatherwork, his dark eyes observing the scene, a sense of hope stirring in his chest as he realized how much the cabin had changed in just a few days. As the days passed, Maren's domestic covenant transformed the neglected homestead into a clean and orderly shelter. She scrubbed the soot-stained walls of the cabin, washed the single window until the autumn light could enter, and organized the sparse kitchen shelves. She spent her afternoons splitting kindling from the dry pine logs Caleb hauled from the breaks, her arms growing stronger with every swing of the small axe. The cabin began to smell of warm hickory smoke, dried wild herbs, and fresh bread, replacing the damp, musty odor of neglect. Caleb worked in the fields with renewed energy, repairing the sagging barn roof and rebuilding the broken corral fences. His movements no longer weighed down by the heavy grief that had paralyzed him. The two of them rarely spoke more than a few words at a time, but their shared silence was no longer cold. It was the quiet partnership of survivors. The quiet peace they had built was shattered a week later when the sound of galloping horses echoed off the valley walls. Silas Vance, a wealthy land speculator from the town, rode into the yard on a fine black horse, accompanied by two hired men with stern faces and clean coats. Vance dismounted and walked onto the cabin porch, his heavy leather boots stomping on the dry timber as he pounded on the door. When Caleb came out of the barn to meet him, Vance pulled a set of official papers from his pocket and shook them in Caleb's face. He claimed that a corrupt land survey had invalidated the homestead's boundaries and that Caleb now owed a debt of $150 to the land office. Vance had purchased the debt himself and demanded the money before the first hard winter frost, threatening to return with the sheriff and enforce a foreclosure if the coins were not produced. Vance wanted the property because Caleb's land controlled the creek's water rights, which were essential for the timber mill Vance planned to build downriver. He looked at the cabin, then at Maren, who stood near the door with her wool shawl wrapped tight around her. He sneered, calling her a plain, penniless drifter who would only bring the homestead to ruin, suggesting that Caleb was foolish to keep a useless mouth around the ranch. The insult was a familiar sting to Maren, bringing back the cruel words of her stepmother and making her feel the weight of her plainness. She lowered her eyes, her fingers tightening on the doorframe as she prepared herself for the inevitable rejection. But Caleb did not stand by. He stepped firmly between the speculator and Maren, his tall frame blocking Vance's path. Caleb's voice was low and dangerous as he commanded Vance to leave his land, stating that the debt would be met and that Maren was a respected member of his household who would not be insulted on his property. Vance laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that echoed off the stony hills, before mounting his horse and riding away with his men. Once the riders disappeared over the ridge, Maren felt the weight of the trouble her presence was causing. She told Caleb she would pack her canvas bundle and return to the trail so he would not have to fight the town speculators on her account. But Caleb looked at her with quiet intensity, telling her that her hard work had saved his daughter's spirit and that he would not break their covenant for any man's threat. His protective words began to heal the old wounds of rejection in Maren's mind, giving her renewed determination to save the home they were building. The speculator's threat hung over the cabin like a dark winter cloud, but Maren refused to let fear paralyze her. She spent the next morning walking through the drawers, searching for wild walnuts and goldenrod to make dyes for the yarn she had spun. She gathered the green hulls of the walnuts in her apron, her fingers staining a deep brown from the juice. She also picked the yellow goldenrod flowers, their bright heads nodding in the freezing wind, and carried them back to the cabin. She set 2 large iron pots of water to boil on the stove, filling the room with the pungent, earthy scent of boiling leaves and hulls. She immersed the skeins of wool into the pots, watching the yarn absorb the natural colors until they turned into rich shades of forest brown and golden yellow. While the yarn was drying, Maren resolved to work even harder to ensure the debt could be paid before the freezing weather locked the earth. The next morning, she took a heavy iron hoe and went to the sloping field behind the cabin, where she began clearing the dry, rocky soil by hand to plant a crop of corn. The work was grueling, requiring her to lift heavy stones and till the hard dirt under the biting wind, but she refused to rest. She dragged the wild sagebrush roots out of the ground, her hands blistering under her leather gloves as she prepared the soil. Clara began to follow her out to the field, carrying a small leather pouch of seed corn and carefully dropping the yellow kernels into the deep furrows Maren dug. One afternoon, as they sat together on a log, Clara looked up at Maren's wind-chapped face and spoke her first words in a year, asking if the green shoots would rise before the winter snow. Maren pulled the child into a warm embrace, her heart swelling with a mother's protective love. The days turned into weeks, and the green shoots of the corn began to rise from the dark soil, a small miracle in the middle of the rocky valley. Maren and Clara tended the field together every day, weeding the rows and carrying water from the creek in wooden buckets. The physical labor was hard on Maren's back, but she found a strange peace in the quiet routine. She watched Clara's silent grief lift as the child worked beside her, her voice returning in small, hesitant phrases as they talked about the plants. Caleb watched them from the corral, his own heart healing as he saw his daughter laugh for the first time since her mother's death. The bond between Maren and the small family was growing stronger, built on a foundation of mutual aid and quiet respect. But the harsh frontier soon tested them again when a freezing rain swept through the valley, and Clara fell ill with a sudden burning fever. The little girl shivered under her heavy quilts, her skin hot and her breathing shallow, while Caleb paced the floor in a panic, fearing the same illness that had taken his wife. Maren remained calm and focused, brewing a hot tea from dried willow bark and wild mint she had gathered along the creek. For 3 days and nights she did not close her eyes, sitting tirelessly by the child's bedside to bathe Clara's forehead with cool water and keep the wood stove stoked to a steady warmth. On the 4th morning, the fever finally broke, and Clara opened her eyes to ask for a cup of fresh water, cementing Maren's position as the true protector of the household. During the long days of Clara's recovery, Maren stayed by the child's side, keeping the fire going and singing her soft frontier tunes. Caleb sat near the bed, his face lined with exhaustion and relief, watching Maren's gentle hands tend his daughter. He realized that the woman he had taken in as a plain stranger had become the very anchor of his life. He told her that he would never let Vance or anyone else take this homestead from them, and that he would find a way to pay the debt. Maren looked at him, her eyes steady behind her spectacles, and told him that they would pay the debt together through the honest work of their hands. The shared struggle had forged a bond between them that went far deeper than their initial pact. Once Clara was strong enough to play in the yard, Maren returned to the wool she had spun and dyed. She gathered the rich brown and golden skeins, tying them into neat bundles with hemp string. She also harvested the early corn from the field, husking the ears and drying the kernels near the stove. She spent hours grinding the dried corn into a fine, sweet meal, packing it into clean canvas sacks she had sewn from scraps. Caleb loaded the spun wool and the bags of cornmeal onto the wooden wagon, driving Maren to the regional trading post to sell their goods. The merchants at the post were astonished by the exceptional quality of Maren's dyed yarn and the purity of her ground corn, sparking a bidding rivalry among the buyers. By the end of the day, Maren held a heavy leather pouch containing 150 silver coins, the exact sum needed to clear the homestead's debt. The ride back to the homestead was quiet, the silver coins clinking softly in the leather pouch Maren held on her lap. Caleb drove the wagon under a grey sky, the air cold and still as the first snow of the winter began to fall. They did not speak, but the tension that had hung over them for weeks was gone, replaced by a deep sense of accomplishment. They had worked the soil and tended the sheep, and through their own sweat, they had earned the right to keep their home. As they drove down the valley, Maren looked at the white peaks of the Wind River Range, no longer feeling like a cast-off drifter, but like a woman who had found her place in the wilderness. On the morning of the deadline, as the first hard winter frost covered the prairie with a sparkling sheet of white ice, Silas Vance returned with the corrupt land agent and the county sheriff. Vance smiled triumphantly as he stepped into the yard, demanding that Caleb sign over the deed to the ranch due to the unpaid survey debt. Before Caleb could respond, Maren stepped out of the cabin door, carrying the heavy leather pouch of silver coins and placing it firmly on the table in front of the sheriff. She presented the official receipt from the trading post, proving the silver was earned through honest trade of wool and corn. The sheriff counted the coins, signed the deed release and ordered Vance and the land agent to leave the property immediately, warning them never to return. The speculators rode away in silent defeat, leaving the homestead in peace, and Caleb turned to Maren with eyes that no longer saw a plain helper, but the woman who had saved his family. He took her hands in his, asking her to stay with him forever as his wife, and they soon traveled to the town chapel to be wed under the eyes of the community. The town gossips, who had once turned Maren away on the road, watched in respectful silence as the preacher blessed the union, recognizing the dignity she had brought to the valley. Under the sturdy pine rafters, surrounded by the warmth of the roaring stove and the laughter of Clara, Caleb took Maren's hand, knowing their quiet covenant had built a sanctuary that no winter storm could ever shake.